Origen is arguably the most significant and controversial Christian of the first handful of centuries in the Church. His legacy is felt almost everywhere in one form or another. His influence is as deep as it is widespread. Yet, like our good friend Tertullian, there is no saint in front of his name. Even though many consider him a martyr, still it is not Saint Origen. The problem is, you see, that although great defenders of orthodox teaching claimed Origen as their own, men like Athanasius and the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory, Basil and Gregory, so likewise did the heresiarch Arius, whose teaching these great men of God spent their lives opposing. It's a rare thing when someone can be championed by both sides of an argument. And that this was the case with Origen gives a hint into not only his fame and his influence, but the complexity and expansiveness of his thinking. There are even two crises in church history named after him, originally the first Origenist and the second Origenist crises, the second of which finally put the nail in the coffin and had his promoters labelled heretics. Now, Origen is widely regarded as one of the greatest minds to ever live. He was one of, if not the most prolific author in ancient history, writing an estimated 6,000 different works, at least 2,000 or so of which were full books. He was followed day and night by a team of scribes who would write down his every thought and reflection on every topic under the sun. He published numerous sermons, biblical commentaries, apologetic works against the most prolific atheist and pagan authors of his day, biblical scholarship manuals, sermons, systematic theological and philosophical writings. Even though he was a Christian, pagan philosophers sought him out to learn from him. The famous Greek philosopher Porphyry sought him out that he might attend Origen's lectures. Origen was called in an official capacity to speak to the governor of Arabia, escorted there by Roman guards that he might explain what Christianity was all about. He was even requested to go to Antioch to speak of such things to the mother of the then Roman emperor. His excellence, his ability, it was obvious at an early age. But it was not an easy childhood. He was born in about AD 185 in Alexandria, which we spoke about last week, and his life would be turned upside down when he was 17 years old. You see, under the same persecution that led to Clement fleeing the catechetical school in Alexandria, Origen's father was arrested for proclaiming Christ, and he was due to be martyred. Now, Origen was passionate about Jesus and he wanted to be martyred alongside his father. But his mother wasn't so happy with this plan, and so she had a cunning plan. She hid all of his clothes in the night, and when he woke up, planning to go into the street to proclaim the gospel of Jesus and be arrested and martyred with his father, he had nothing to wear. Unwilling to go out and shame himself by preaching Christ naked, he stayed in the house. His mother's plan worked. But he nonetheless wrote a very powerful and moving letter to his father, encouraging his father to hold the faith, even if it meant being martyred. I wonder how many of us, if push came to shove, could write such a letter to our father, to our loved one, or to our own children, encouraging them to die for the sake of the gospel rather than defame the name of Jesus. Well, with Clement having fled the city, the catechetical school in Alexandria was lacking a master, and so Bishop Demetrius, or Pope Demetrius of Alexandria, put Origen in charge at the mere age of 18. Can you imagine that? It's mind-boggling for an 18-year-old to be so widely respected and well known as an academic that they're placed in charge of the foremost Christian university and education establishment in the world. His impressiveness was remarkable, but ultimately it would court jealousy and lead to his downfall. Before that, though, we need to consider other aspects of his life which would also get him into trouble. You see, Origen was not only a brilliant mind, but he was of singular will and determination, extraordinarily so. He lived on a sparse diet, with very little food, strictly vegetarian, and no alcohol. He slept only on the floor, and he owned only one coat and no shoes, taking very literally some of the teachings of Jesus. And in his younger life, he took them, to his own admittance, far too literally, and he did something rather silly. You see, he was getting aroused by women, and he feared that he might fall into sexual sin. And so he followed very literally the advice of Jesus. He went to a surgeon and he had himself castrated. Origen was now a eunuch. Now, he did come to regret this in later life and think it was a wrong decision, but this kind of seeking after a simple and sparse life was known as asceticism, and individuals like Origen would be there in an age before monasticism, but his influence on it would be clear for all to see. Now, it's perhaps partly due to the fact he was a eunuch that Bishop Demetrius of Alexandria refused on multiple occasions to ordain Origen as a presbyter. You see, a canon, that's a church law at the time, said eunuchs could not be ministers, based on the teaching in Deuteronomy that priests could not be eunuchs. More likely, though, this was an excuse. The real issue was power. Demetrius was about the business of raising the Bishop of Alexandria into the major power in Egypt and across the Mediterranean. Before Demetrius was bishop in Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria was a figurehead of sorts. He was one person elected by others, and he was still considered to be a presbyter, respected more, but of equal rank in some sense. After Demetrius, the Bishop of Alexandria was well above everybody else. He was the Pope of Alexandria. He had absolute authority. His teaching was respected across Egypt, and his influence could be felt across the Mediterranean. To such a man as this, with such a plan, someone as remarkable as Origen was clearly a threat. By refusing to ordain him, Origen was effectively kept out of church politics and power, while Demetrius built up the power of himself and his successors. Things worsened for Origen when travelling through Palestine, and the local bishops there invited him to preach, something traditionally only ordained presbyters did. Now, Origen accepted, and he gave a number of lectures and sermons. And then news got back to Demetrius in Alexandria, who was furious, and he demanded that Origen return back to Alexandria at once. Origen obeyed his bishop. Then in about AD 231, Origen was sent to Athens by Demetrius, and on the way round the Mediterranean, he stopped once again in the Holy Land in Caesarea. And there, a different bishop ordained him as a presbyter. Demetrius was furious. He excommunicated Origen and labelled him a heretic, claiming that he taught that in the end, even Satan himself would be saved by God. Now, this is something that Origen himself denies teaching, but more on that later. Having been excommunicated in his home of Alexandria, Origen chose to stay in Caesarea, and he founded a school there, one which quickly came to rival that of Alexandria, and in Origen's own lifetime arguably eclipse it. So great was the influence of this one man. Now, in AD 250, Emperor Decius began what is known as the Decian persecution. He sent out an edict across the whole empire that said, this is what must happen. Everybody in the empire, except for Jews, must make sacrifices to pagan gods in support of the emperor, and do so in front of a Roman magistrate who will write a writ of authentication to say that they have done so. This was bad for the church. Many people were martyred, including Pope Fabian in Rome and also Patriarch of Antioch, Babylas. They were martyred along with countless others. Many others, such as Cyprian, fled into hiding. And many Christians compromised. They did the sacrifices as they were told. Having lost his father to martyrdom, having lost since then a number of prominent friends, and even having written a book on martyrdom, it should not surprise us that Origen was not one who fell away. He refused to make the sacrifices, and he was arrested. For 2 years, he was tortured. You see, the governor of Caesarea, knowing how prominent this man was, refused to let him die until he recanted his faith. And so the torture went on and on until Emperor Decian died. And finally, Origen was released from prison. But the immense suffering he had over those 2 years was too great, and he died less than a year after he was released at the age of 69. It was in Caesarea where he completed what was arguably his greatest work, the Hexapla. This Hexapla, as it's called, was a work that took 28 years in the making. It was a monstrous project, the like of which was never attempted again till the Reformation. Here in the early 3rd century we see the beginning of what is known as textual criticism. Textual criticism. You see, in his previous visit to the Holy Land, when he first preached there and got in trouble, Origen came across a manuscript of the Hebrew Old Testament, and he was fascinated. He didn't read Hebrew at the time, but he found himself a tutor who could teach him. Only Origen and later Jerome could claim among the church fathers to know both Greek and Hebrew. Now, knowing that the Jews of his day claimed the Christians had changed the Old Testament, Origen wanted to see what the truth of this was. He went to discover it. And so he created a physically huge set of books that could not be removed from the building they were in, so massive were they. And these books were known as the Hexapla. And in that was 6 and sometimes up to 9 columns of text. The first column contained the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. The second column contained in Greek letters the pronunciation of the Hebrew letters. And then he had the Septuagint, the main text that was used by Christians. In the next column, he had a Greek translation of the Old Testament by a Jew, Theodotion, from about AD 180. In the next column, he had another Jewish translation of the Old Testament, this time by Aquila of Sinope, which dated from around AD 130. And finally, in the last column, he had the Greek Old Testament of the Ebionite Symmachus, which dates from around the year AD 200. The Ebionites were a very strict and ascetic sect of heretics who denied that Jesus was God from all eternity. And what Origen did with these, and at times others, was compare and contrast them. And he would make different marks to say where different parts of a text were found and where they were missing and what changes might be found. Though through his own study, Jerome would choose the Hebrew over the Greek for his translation of the Bible, known as the Vulgate. It's a Latin version. It would not be till the Reformation that such a massive project would come to take place again. It's maybe worth noting, though, that Origen seems to have continued favouring the Septuagint Greek rather than the Hebrew, though occasionally he would say things like, however, this manuscript says ... Beyond textual criticism, one major influence he had on the church was his use of allegory in biblical interpretation. Now, this is something we've mentioned before, but Origen is such a master of it that he manifests it into a fine art. According to Origen, every Bible text has 3 layers of meaning. There's the flesh of the Bible passage, which is the surface level, historical, literal meaning that anyone, even a pagan, can grasp. And then below the flesh is the moral meaning of the passage, which teaches us how we should live, which only a baptized Christian or a fairly lax Christian might understand. But below the flesh, below the moral, comes the final level, the spirit of the text. Here we see the eternal reality and meaning behind the text, the most important meaning, which only the most advanced and enlightened Christians could see and fathom. This is something of a Gnostic tendency and influence, this idea of a hidden spiritual knowledge which only a few ever get to see. Now, for an example, the most profound of Origen's allegorical readings, which builds on what the Jews were already doing but advances on it, whether right or wrong, which lasted through the centuries, is his interpretation of the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. He said this is not a book about the relationship between Solomon and his bride. This is a book, really, spiritually, all about Jesus Christ and the church. And that is a teaching still taught all over the Christian world today. But it wasn't just textual criticism and biblical interpretation where he was influential. It was the fact that he was the first Christian to write what we might call a systematic theology, a 4-book series where he took all the teaching of the Bible and he systematized it into an easily understandable and readable system. This is called On First Principles. That's the title of these books, On First Principles. Yet it was here, in his theology, that he ran into the most trouble. The problem is, when someone writes down everything that comes across their mind, sometimes you don't look over it carefully and say, do I really want to publish this? You see, often Origen would conduct thought experiments and think through different ways of looking at problems and questions without intending to say that the conclusion he comes to is actually the right answer or what he believes. And so it was with the claim that even Satan himself would eventually be saved. Something Origen in a later letter says he certainly never meant to claim or even suggest. In fact, he says the idea that Satan can be saved is ridiculous. But what were these problematic teachings? And did he actually teach them at various points? What were these things that ultimately led to him being labelled a heretic? Well, it begins with the fact that he did believe in the pre-existence of souls. Let's paint a picture of how Origen understood the world and salvation. For Origen, all souls of humans and demons and angels and Christ existed before the creation of the world. And there before creation, due to pride, was the real fall. And at that point, people fell away from God. Those who fell the furthest from God were the demons, with Satan being the furthest still. Those who only fell a little distance from God were the archangels, and then the angels a little further. And somewhere between the angels and the demons in this fall were the souls that would become us, that would become human. And there was one soul that didn't fall at all, but clung still to God, who joined himself to the Logos, to the Word of God. And that is the soul that Christ, the Logos, took with him when he became human flesh. Now, being so close to God for so long, according to Origen, this soul began to take on divine attributes, things that are only true of God himself. And this meant that when he became flesh, it was impossible for God, for Jesus to sin, because this soul was not a normal human soul. It couldn't be tempted as we are tempted. It's like, and this is how Origen explained it, when you place iron into a furnace, after a while it changes. It takes on the properties of the fire all around it. It becomes the same colour as the fire. It radiates the same heat as the fire. It can set other things on fire, like the fire. And so it was that this soul that never fell became more and more and more like God. And Origen claims that is the end purpose of everything, and that in the end, all souls, even those of devils and demons, would eventually be made like God. It's unclear how much of that he really taught, but the first part certainly does seem to be his teaching. And part of the reason why he could claim that this would happen is he didn't believe in a physical resurrection of the dead, which meant these souls could spend all eternity being purified in some sense and brought closer and closer to God. All of this is, of course, very, very problematic. The pre-existence of souls is found nowhere inside Scripture, especially not in the kind of narrative he painted of souls falling different distances from God and some becoming angels or demons or humans. The idea that the soul of Christ was not a human soul or any longer a human soul as we might know it undermines the incarnation and our salvation. The denial of the bodily resurrection of Christ and of others is immediately a no-go for Christian orthodoxy. Likewise, the idea that humans can take on divine attributes, even Jesus take on divine attributes, over time is something that would be strongly rejected by the Church, rejected as heresy at the Council of Chalcedon 2 centuries later. Worse still, Origen seemed to believe that the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, was in some way lesser than the Father, subordinate to the Father, not completely equal with the Father. Yes, Jesus was God, Origen would say, but he wasn't the God. Now, this confusion over how the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is God, would later be used by Arius and his followers, the Arians, who were the first major church-wide threatening group of heretics that a whole church council, known as an ecumenical council, would need to address. Issues with the teaching of Origen around these areas came to a head in the first Origenist crisis in the late 4th century. Now, this involved bishops from across the Holy Land and Egypt, as well as the great scholar Jerome, and the crisis threatened to split the church between those who refused to condemn Origen, often thinking it was impossible to condemn someone who was already dead, for heresy that is, for thinking that his teaching was vague but not intentionally heretical, speculative but not definitively heretical, or that his teaching had simply been corrupted. They were on one side, and on the other were those who wanted Origen condemned as a heretic, for above all, pushing these kind of heretical ideas, but also an extreme kind of asceticism. In Alexandria there were riots on the streets. Ultimately, in AD 400, Origen was condemned as a heretic by a council in Alexandria headed up by the Pope of Alexandria. The idea that God no longer had a human body, because Origen denied the bodily resurrection, being the final tipping point. As ever though, in all of this crisis, politics and power played a large part in how the sides were drawn and who switched sides when, including the Pope who condemned him, who previously, before certain riots, had actually promoted him. Issues would explode again 200 years later in the late 6th century when Byzantine monasticism was at its apex. This was the second Origenist crisis. This time it seemed to be more an issue with people who claimed to follow Origen than with actually the man himself. Nonetheless, the Origenists were condemned at the council, the Second Council of Constantinople, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. But there is some discrepancy in the records from that council over whether the name of Origen, the individual, is actually condemned in the council. Despite all this, Origen remained popular, and many were fascinated by him, and all this bad press, the biggest effect it had is that almost all of his works were lost to history. Around 600 volumes of his work still remain out of 6,000, but only about 20 have ever been translated into English, which contributes to the vast amount of uncertainty over what he actually believed at various points in his life about some things. What can't be denied is his impact on the church would extend right through to a Reformation, with the scholar Erasmus being inspired by Origen to begin textual criticism, to look at the Greek and the Hebrew and compare it to the Latin of his day, to look at different manuscripts and ask, what did the original manuscripts say? The errors he found in the Latin translation of the Bible would ultimately provide much of the fuel on the fire of the Protestant Reformation that kept it burning to this very day, even if it didn't provide the spark and the accelerant. But that story is literally centuries away. So a few questions to close. Politics and power seem to be having a bigger influence on the church. First between Origen and Demetrius, and later in the Origenist crises. Does this surprise you? How do you feel and respond to this? Secondly, why is biblical criticism important? And why do you think it was neglected after Origen and Jerome for so many centuries until we reached the Reformation? Origen lived in a time before the great ecumenical councils hashed out the best way to phrase and frame the biblical witness about God and Jesus. How much leeway should we give to him and others like him? Should they be considered heretics or just mistaken and ignorant of what we now know? Finally, where do you see the various points I've mentioned of Origen's life and thinking, biblical, theological, moral, alive and active in the church today?